China is currently facing an unprecedented level of civil unrest as people take to the streets to protest strict lockdown measures that have been in place for nearly 3 years. The country's zero-COVID policy has resulted in significant social consequences, including families being separated and apartment doors being welded shut, all in an effort to contain the spread of an illness that the Chinese population is beginning to realize may not be as severe as the measures taken to combat it. This recent wave of unrest is just the latest in a series of negative news stories emanating from the world's second-largest economy, which is governed by leaders who are not directly accountable to the people. While civil demonstrations against lockdown restrictions are not uncommon, the situation in mainland China is somewhat distinct. These protests are demanding direct political change at the highest levels of government, and there are no signs of them slowing down. All of this occurred before the government reversed its COVID policy overnight, resulting in a surge of infections and the imposition of widespread lockdowns, affecting as many as 37 million people per day. However, it is important to note that the likelihood of a full-fledged revolution is extremely low, despite some media outlets suggesting otherwise. It is crucial, from an altruistic standpoint, that we do not desire the collapse of the economy through violent revolution or social breakdown. The existing system, flawed as it may be, supports millions of economically vulnerable individuals. Even from a selfish perspective, one of the reasons we pay close attention to China is due to our dependence on it. China purchases raw materials, invests in various economies, manufactures consumer goods, and provides the equipment necessary for running our economies. Given the current instability in the country, it may be an opportune time to address some important questions. Firstly, what would be the impact of a Chinese economic collapse on the global economy? Secondly, how can we minimize the potential repercussions on our own economies? Finally, is it possible that this unfortunate situation could have positive outcomes for certain countries around the world? It is important to acknowledge that nobody can accurately predict the future, including economists. Therefore, any speculation about a hypothetical Chinese collapse and its impact on the global economy must be approached with caution. However, history provides us with a comparable example in the form of the Soviet Union. Once the second-largest economy in the world, the Soviet Union's collapse led to civil unrest, economic stagnation, and a series of large-scale disasters. Although the collapse had varying effects on different countries, nations outside of Soviet influence remained relatively unaffected. The global GDP actually increased after the collapse of the Soviet Union, albeit at a slower pace compared to previous periods. This suggests that a collapse in China might not have catastrophic consequences on a global scale, but there are crucial differences between China and the Soviet Union. The first significant factor to consider is the size difference. When comparing the collapse of the USSR and the hypothetical collapse of China, the USSR had a total output of approximately $1.6 trillion, accounting for around 7% of the global output of $23.8 trillion at that time. In contrast, China's GDP currently stands at $17.8 trillion, constituting roughly 18.5% of the world's total economic output of $96 trillion. If we simply rely on these raw numbers, a proportional drop similar to the USSR's collapse would result in an impact 2.5 times worse, equivalent to the magnitude of the COVID pandemic's effect on the global economy. However, it would be imprudent to solely rely on these raw numbers. To begin with, global economic growth today is not as robust as it was in the 1980s and 1990s, averaging roughly 0.5% lower. Unlike during the collapse of the USSR, there are no massive emerging economies like China to bolster global growth figures. Additionally, when the USSR fragmented, some constituent states fared relatively well. East Germany, for example, was in the process of economic reunification with West Germany and benefited from merging with the world's third-largest economy at that time. Moreover, the key distinction between the USSR and China lies in globalization. China is much more integrated into the global economy compared to the relatively isolated USSR. The world as a whole is also significantly more interconnected than it was 3 decades ago, with global supply chains, multinational corporations, international finance, and widespread communications spanning countries. While the impacts of the USSR on the world should not be underestimated, China's deep integration into the global economy makes it challenging to envision its removal with minimal disruption. Notably, China currently accounts for 12.5% of total global trade, whereas the USSR was responsible for less than 1% of global trade during its peak. The significance of trade as a percentage of total global output is crucial to comprehend. This metric reflects the value added to the global economy through the trade of goods and services between countries. Although trade represents around 10% of the American economy's output, it is important to note that it contributes to global GDP figures rather than domestic GDP. Globally integrated economies like China and the United States engage in trade that enriches the world economy but may not directly impact domestic consumption. For instance, countries like Belgium have trade representing 169% of the total GDP, and trade in Hong Kong accounts for 403% of its total output, as it serves as a hub for international trade and services. Currently, global trade represents a lower percentage of global output compared to its peak in 2007 when it accounted for 61% of global output. The decline following the global financial crisis, GFC, and China's transition towards developing its domestic market and reducing reliance on cheap production for export were significant factors contributing to this trend. Moreover, the COVID pandemic caused a sharp drop in global trade, but specific figures for 2021 and 2022 have not yet been released by the World Bank. However, it is generally expected that global trade will rebound to around 55%. Despite this decline, even at 52% of total global output, the disappearance of 12.5% overnight without rapid replacement from other countries or a new regime in China would lead to the most severe economic downturn in recorded history. While it is highly unlikely that the Chinese economy will collapse completely in the near future, it is important to address the exaggerated claims often found in clickbait headlines and thumbnails. China does face significant problems, but industries closely tied to the global economy, such as those involved in international services, raw material imports, and manufactured goods exports, are more resilient to internal turmoil because of their dependence on the global economy rather than the domestic Chinese market. To illustrate this concept on a small scale, consider someone like myself who operates a business providing video explanations of economics. This service is mainly exported to viewers worldwide, and services like entertainment and education count as exports if they are consumed in a different country than where they are produced. If the Australian economy were to collapse completely tomorrow, I would continue creating videos because I could still earn income by exporting my work to viewers in functioning economies. Of course, this assumes that the economic collapse is not so severe that I lose access to electricity and the internet. In such a scenario, I could relocate my business to another country and continue operations, ensuring that the value of my service is not lost. Apologies if this example came across as arrogant or self-important, but the main idea is to emphasize that on a larger scale, businesses in China would face short-term disruptions if they were to relocate. However, if we are discussing a situation where China's electricity grid fails, the world would likely face more significant problems than just an economic recession. Lastly, the fact that the world relies on China contributes to the country's economic robustness, making it unlikely for China to suddenly cease its contribution to the global economy. While events like a potential invasion of Thailand that triggers Russian-style sanctions could quickly and severely isolate China, it is more likely that any economic collapse within China would occur over a prolonged period. This timeline would allow industries enough time to establish operations in alternative economies, mitigating the overall impact. So, what do you think? Feel free to discuss in the comments section below. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to Trending Updates.